What would you do if the only thing you had left to your name was a debt you didn't incur and a choice you couldn't afford? What if, to settle that debt, you accepted a piece of paper everyone in the world called worthless, a brittle, hand-drawn map to a place that likely didn't exist? For Grace Whitcomb, a young woman in the hard-scrabble Arizona territory of the 1880s, this wasn't a question. It was the only path left. She traded the last of her father's reputation for a fool's errand, a map sealed 50 years earlier by the outlaw Gideon Vale. But the truth waiting in that canyon, behind a door of solid iron, was heavier than gold and more dangerous than any outlaw's ghost. Settle in and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we tell a story of how a dismissed woman and a forgotten map rewrote the history of a town built on secrets. Grace Whitcomb stood in the dusty air of the lawyer's office in Redemption. The silence as heavy as the unwept tears in her throat. The room smelled of dry paper, stale tobacco, and the finality of things. Outside, the sun beat down on the plank sidewalks, but here, in the cool dimness, her father's life was being tallied into a column of red ink. He had been a good man, but not a successful one. His dreams, like the arid soil of their failed homestead, had turned to dust, leaving behind a ledger of debts that now belonged to her. Across the desk, Silas Croft, the town's banker and primary landowner, cleared his throat with a sound like rocks grinding together. He was a man made of straight lines and sharp angles, his face a mask of predatory patience. "The total stands at $400, Miss Whitcomb," he said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "The livery, the general store, the feed loan, it's all here." $400. It might as well have been a mountain of gold. She had $17 in a cloth purse and a mule named Ebenezer. That was the entirety of her inheritance. Her gaze fell to the worn leather of her father's satchel on the floor, the one he'd carried everywhere. It contained his prospecting journals, sketches of rock formations, and his unshakable belief that he was always just one step away from finding his fortune. It was that belief that had killed him, chasing a vein of silver in a summer storm that turned the canyons into a churning fury. The town lawyer, a man named Peters with a perpetually worried expression, shifted in his chair. "Silas, the girl has nothing. Her father's tools won't fetch $20. Croft's eyes, small and dark, flickered with something that wasn't quite amusement, but was its cruel cousin. "There is one other asset," he said slowly, reaching into a drawer. "Something your father offered as collateral on his last loan. He swore it was worth more than the town itself." He slid a folded, yellowed piece of parchment across the polished wood. "A map." Grace picked it up. The paper was brittle. The ink faded to a ghostly brown. It depicted a canyon, landmarks sketched with a rough but certain hand. A rock formation called the Weeping Woman's Stone, a twisted juniper, and finally, a stark X against a sheer cliff face. At the bottom, in a spidery script, were the words, "Gideon Vale, his vault, 1832. The name hung in the air, a piece of local legend. Vale was a ghost, an outlaw from a half-century before, said to have vanished with a fortune in stolen bullion. Most believed he'd died in the desert, his treasure lost forever." Croft chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "A fairy tale, worthless, but it's all that's left. The debt is yours to bear, Miss Whitcomb, unless you'd care to sign over the deed to your father's dust patch." He wanted the land, what little there was of it, for the water rights. That was the real game. She looked at the map, then at Croft's smug face. In that moment, something hardened in her. It was a choice between surrendering her father's last piece of ground to this vulture, or embracing a fool's hope. "I'll take the map," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "as payment in full for the debts." Peters gaped at her. Croft's smirk widened. "Done," he said, slamming a heavy ledger shut. "The debts of John Whitcomb are cleared, in exchange for a piece of fantasy." Grace folded the map, her knuckles white. She did not look at either man as she picked up her father's satchel and walked out, the sound of Croft's low, satisfied laughter following her into the blinding Arizona sun. She led Ebenezer from the livery stable, the old mule's ears drooping in the afternoon heat. He was a creature of immense patience and quiet dignity, much like the man who had owned him. Grace paused to run a hand along his coarse, gray neck, her forehead resting against his for a moment. He was all she had left of her father's world. The whispers followed her as she walked down the town's main street. She felt the eyes of merchants in their doorways, of women behind their lace curtains. The story had already flown from the lawyer's office, carried on wings of gossip and disbelief. Took a map? For $400. That girl's as foolish as her father ever was. She ignored them, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the jagged blue peaks of the Dragoon Mountains clawed at the sky. She needed a quiet place to think, a place where the judgment of redemption couldn't reach her. She found it at the edge of town, in the small, sun-baked cemetery where a simple wooden cross marked her father's grave. She knelt in the dirt, the heat seeping through the fabric of her skirt, and carefully unfolded the map. It was more than just a drawing. The man who made it, Gideon Vale, had known this land intimately. The contour lines were precise, the distances between landmarks noted in small, cramped script. There was a sense of purpose to it, not fantasy. A name caught her eye, written next to a symbol she didn't recognize. The Lock of the Raven. What did it mean? As she traced the faded lines with her finger, a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see Samuel Price. He was a freight hauler, a man who lived in the space between towns. He was quiet, steady, and one of the few people who had shown her father kindness, never judgment. He held out a canteen. "Figured you might be thirsty," he said. His voice was low and calm, a stark contrast to the mocking tones she'd heard all day. "I heard what happened." She took the canteen, her throat tight. "Then you heard I'm a fool." "I heard you honored your father's debt," he corrected gently. He looked at the map in her hands, his expression unreadable. "My own father was a deputy back in the early days. He spent years hunting the remnants of the old outlaw gangs. He used to say they weren't just thieves. Some of them were craftsmen, masons, locksmiths." He nodded toward the parchment. "Gideon Vale was one of them. The story says he never trusted a bank. Built his own." He looked back at her, his eyes serious. "Most folks think it's a legend, Grace, but my father never did. He didn't offer to help, didn't offer advice. He just offered a moment of quiet respect, a belief that what she held might be more than paper and ink. He was giving her back a piece of the dignity the town had tried to strip away. And in the silent heat of that graveyard, a spark of resolve hardened into something unbreakable. What secrets did Gideon Vale seal away in the dark? Is Grace Whitcomb chasing a ghost, or the buried truth of this entire territory? Let us know in the comments what you think is behind that iron door, and be sure to subscribe for the rest of this incredible story. She didn't know it yet, but the key to opening that vault wasn't a tool or a stick of dynamite. It was the history Samuel's own father had spent his life chasing. The next morning, Grace bought what supplies she could afford: flour, salt pork, coffee, and a small box of cartridges for the old rifle her father had left her. The general store was a gauntlet of sideways glances and hushed comments. When she placed her meager items on the counter, Silas Croft was there, leaning against a barrel of nails as if he'd been waiting for her. "Stocking up for your treasure hunt, Miss Whitcomb?" he asked, his voice loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. A few men chuckled. "I hope for your sake Vale's ghost left you a receipt." Grace met his gaze, her expression a careful blank. She paid the storekeeper, her movements deliberate. "I'm not looking for a receipt, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice even. "I'm looking for what's owed." Croft laughed outright. "Owed? Child, the world owes you nothing. Your father chased phantoms his whole life, and it seems the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. You'll be back in a week, broke and humbled, begging for work. Maybe my wife needs a new laundress." The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that rose from her chest to her cheeks. But she would not give him the satisfaction of a response. She simply picked up her canvas sack and turned to leave. As she pushed through the batwing doors, a hand, thin and wrinkled as a dried leaf, touched her arm. She turned to find an old woman named Maria, a fixture on the edge of town, who people said had been there since the territory was still Mexico. Her eyes were dark and deep, holding a wisdom that felt older than the mountains themselves. Maria looked not at Grace, but at the sack of supplies, as if she could see the map through the canvas. "Some doors are graves," the old woman murmured, her voice a dry whisper. "Be careful which bones you wake." And then she was gone, shuffling back into the shadows of an alleyway. The words chilled Grace despite the morning sun. A warning, not a mockery, but a solemn caution that resonated with a deeper truth than Croft's cruel taunts. She loaded her supplies onto Ebenezer's back, her hands moving with a newfound certainty. The laughter in the town was a noise she could ignore. Croft's disdain was a fuel she could burn. But Maria's words were different. They were a weight, a responsibility. This journey was no longer just about a debt, or even about her father's honor. It was about uncovering something that had been deliberately buried, something someone had thought was dangerous enough to seal behind stone and iron. She cinched the last strap and swung herself into the saddle. She didn't look back at the town of Redemption. She faced the east, where the map told her the Weeping Woman Stone stood sentinel over the entrance to a forgotten canyon. The mule took a steady, plodding step, and then another, carrying her away from the world of men and their judgments, and into the vast, indifferent silence of the desert. The landscape that had swallowed her father's dreams was now the keeper of her only hope. And as she rode, the elder's cryptic warning echoed in her mind, a quiet counterpoint to the rhythmic clip-clop of Ebenezer's hooves on the hard-packed earth. Be careful which bones you wake. The sun climbed higher, bleaching the color from the sky, and still they rode on. The journey into the high desert was a trial of sun and silence. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of a relentless sun. Grace learned the rhythms of the land, the way the light changed on the distant mesas, the subtle shift in the air that signaled the coming of evening. Ebenezer was her silent companion, his steadfast pace a comfort in the overwhelming emptiness. He seemed to understand the gravity of their purpose, his ears occasionally flicking back as if to listen to her unspoken thoughts. She followed the map's crude but accurate landmarks, navigating by the shape of a ridge, the course of a dry wash, the shadow of a lone saguaro. Her father had taught her how to read the land, how to find water, how to make a cold camp that left no trace. The skills she had once seen as part of a life she longed to escape were now her only means of survival. On the fourth day, she saw it. From a distance, it was just another rock formation, but as she drew closer, the shape became unmistakable. A tall pillar of red sandstone, weathered by centuries of wind and rain into the shape of a shrouded figure, with dark mineral stains streaking down its face like perpetual tears. The Weeping Woman Stone, a jolt of adrenaline, sharp and clean, cut through her fatigue. The map was real. Her father hadn't been chasing a complete fantasy. She urged Ebenezer forward, her heart pounding a steady rhythm against her ribs. The entrance to the canyon was narrow, a tight split in the rock that was nearly invisible until you were upon it. As they passed through, the temperature dropped. The air grew still and cool, the harsh sunlight blocked by the towering walls of sheer rock on either side. The silence here was different, deeper, more profound. The world of the open desert fell away, replaced by an enclosed space that felt ancient and watchful. The canyon floor was sandy, dotted with stubborn scrub and the skeletal remains of long-dead trees. She followed its winding path for another mile, her eyes scanning the cliff face to her left, just as the map instructed. And then she saw it. At first, it was just a dark patch, a shadow that didn't quite belong. An unnatural rectangle of deeper black against the variegated red of the stone. She dismounted, her boots sinking into the soft sand, and approached slowly, a sense of reverence and dread mixing in her chest. It was a door. Solid iron, pitted with rust but unbreached, set flush into the cliff face. It was at least 7 feet tall and 4 feet wide, with no visible hinges or handle. In its center was a lock, a massive, complex thing of layered plates and tumblers, bigger than her 2 fists put together. Vines and decades of grime clung to its surface, but there was no mistaking its purpose. It was a seal, a declaration that whatever was inside was meant to stay there forever. She reached out and laid a hand on the cold iron. It was immovable, solid, a dead end and a confirmation all at once. For a long moment, she just stood there, the enormity of the challenge before her settling in. She had found the X on the map, but finding the door and opening it were 2 entirely different mountains to climb. That night, she made her camp in a small alcove across from the door, the flames of her small fire casting dancing shadows on the silent iron sentinel. The moon rose, bathing the canyon in a ghostly silver light, and Grace watched the door as if it were a living thing, wondering what secrets it held, and if she would ever be strong enough to force them into the light. For 3 days, Grace did little more than observe. She lived with the door, learning its face in the changing light of the day. In the sharp, cool light of dawn, the rust looked like dried blood. In the flat heat of noon, it seemed to absorb the light, a patch of pure darkness. At dusk, it seemed to recede into the cliff, almost disappearing. She spent hours clearing the packed dirt and tangled growth from its base, her hands raw and scraped. It was a way of claiming the space, of announcing her intention to the silent canyon. She ran her fingers over every inch of the iron plate, searching for a seam, a weakness, a clue. There was nothing. It was a perfect, impenetrable shield. Ebenezer would stand nearby, his head lowered, occasionally letting out a soft sigh that seemed to echo her own frustration. He was her anchor, a living, breathing presence in this place of stone and secrets. On the 4th day, her patience frayed. She tried force. She used the heavy end of a rock hammer from her father's kit, striking the lock with all her strength. The clang echoed unnaturally in the confined space, a sharp, angry sound that quickly died, absorbed by the stone. The lock remained unscratched. The door did not shudder. It was like hitting the mountain itself. Defeated, she sank to the ground, her back against the rock wall, the useless hammer in her lap. It was impossible. Croft had been right. She had traded everything for a dead end. Her gaze drifted over the lock again, not with the intent of force, but with the tired resignation of failure. And that's when she saw it. Tucked away in the corner of the main plate, nearly obscured by a thick patch of hardened moss and grime, was a small, deliberate marking. It wasn't damage from the elements. It was etched into the metal. She took out her knife and carefully, painstakingly, scraped away the accretion. As the last of the grime fell away, the mark was revealed. It was a symbol no bigger than her thumb. A stylized carving of a raven, its head turned back, one of its wings bent at an unnatural angle. A broken wing. The lock of the raven. The phrase from the map clicked into place. This was a maker's mark, a signature. It was a tiny detail, a whisper from the past, but it was the first real clue she had found. It was proof that this lock was not some random piece of hardware, but a specific creation, with a specific origin. It meant something. It was a thread. Her exhaustion fell away, replaced by a surge of renewed purpose. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she could not open this door alone. And she knew there was only one person who might understand the meaning of a broken raven etched in iron. She carefully took a piece of paper from her father's journal and a nub of charcoal from the fire pit. With a steady hand, she made a rubbing of the symbol, capturing its shape and detail. Then, she packed her camp. She gave Ebenezer the last of her water and promised him a full trough soon. As they left the canyon, she glanced back one last time at the iron door. It no longer looked like an ending. It looked like a question. And now, finally, she had a piece of the answer to carry back with her into the world of men. The ride back to redemption was faster, fueled by a singular purpose. She bypassed the main street, guiding Ebenezer down the dusty alleyways to the sprawling, cluttered lot behind the freight office. Samuel Price was there, mending a harness with the slow, methodical movements of a man comfortable with his work. He looked up as she approached, his expression showing no surprise, only a quiet inquiry. He took in her sunburnt face, her dusty clothes, the new intensity in her eyes. "You found something," he stated. It wasn't a question. She didn't waste words. She slid from Ebenezer's back and held out the small folded piece of paper. "On the lock," she said simply. He took the paper and unfolded it, his brow furrowing as he studied the charcoal rubbing of the broken-winged raven. He held it to the light, turning it over in his calloused fingers. For a long moment, he said nothing, his face a study in concentration. He traced the outline of the symbol with his thumb, a flicker of something distant and half-remembered in his eyes. "I've seen this before," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "A long time ago." He motioned for her to follow him into the small, cramped office at the back of the warehouse. The room was filled with shipping manifests, ledgers, and the smell of old leather and oil. He went to a heavy wooden chest in the corner, unlocked it, and lifted the lid. From beneath a stack of old maps, he pulled out a thick, leather-bound book. It was worn and battered, the cover soft with age. "My father's," he explained, laying it on the desk. He kept a record of every outlaw, every gang, every symbol he ever encountered. He carefully turned the brittle pages, which were filled with his father's neat, precise handwriting and stark, detailed sketches. There were brands, tattoos, and maker's marks. He flipped past symbols for the Clanton gang, the Cochise Cowboys, until finally he stopped. There, on a page dedicated to a gang known as the Broken Wing Ravens, was a perfect drawing of the symbol from her rubbing. Grace leaned closer, her breath catching in her throat. According to the notes, the Ravens weren't just bandits. They were engineers and safecrackers from back east who came out west for the gold rush. Their leader, a man named Corvus, had been a master locksmith. They specialized not in robbing banks, but in building impenetrable vaults for other wealthier outlaws. Gideon Vale's name was mentioned in a later entry. Vale commissioned Corvus for a private vault in the Dragoons, circa 1832. Location unknown. Said to be his masterpiece. Samuel looked up from the book, his eyes meeting hers. The legend was real. The history was right here, in his father's hand. "This isn't just a door, Grace," he said, his voice low with the weight of the discovery. "It's a Corvus vault. My father wrote that they were impossible to drill, impossible to blast. They were built with traps and false mechanisms." A grim understanding passed between them. This was no longer Grace's solitary quest. It was a piece of his own history, too. "We'll need more than a hammer," he said. The next 2 days were a blur of quiet, focused preparation. They gathered heavy-duty drills, pry bars made of tempered steel, a sledgehammer, and as a last resort, a carefully measured quantity of black powder. They told no one where they were going. Under the cover of a moonless night, they loaded the supplies onto a pack mule and rode out of Redemption, 2 determined figures against the vast, sleeping landscape. The labor that followed was the hardest either of them had ever known. They worked in shifts, the canyon echoing with the rhythmic, brutal clang of steel on steel. The drills barely scratched the surface of the lock. The pry bars bent against the door's unyielding frame. They were chipping away at a mountain with a teaspoon, their muscles screaming in protest, their hopes starting to fray with every failed attempt. The door held its secrets, guarding them with an indifferent and absolute strength. Days of fruitless, punishing labor had worn them down. Their hands were blistered, their muscles ached with a deep, unyielding fatigue, and their spirits were as battered as their tools. They sat by the fire one evening, the silent iron door looming in the darkness across the way, a monument to their failure. "My father tracked these men for a decade," Samuel said, staring into the flames. "He wrote that they were clever. They thought differently. They didn't build things to be broken into by force. They built them to be opened by wit." He stood up and walked toward the door, holding a lantern high. Grace followed. He wasn't looking at the lock anymore. He was running his hand over the rock face surrounding the doorframe. "He wrote about Corvus," Samuel continued, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet canyon. "He said Corvus always left a key, not a metal key, but a key in the construction, a keystone, something that looked like it belonged, but didn't." They began a new kind of search, not of the door, but of its setting. They examined every crack, every discoloration, every inch of the stone wall in a 10-foot radius around the vault. It was Grace who found it. Her fingers, sensitive from days of work, brushed against a section of rock just above the door. While the surrounding stone was rough and weathered, this one spot, a piece of sandstone no bigger than a loaf of bread, felt different. It was subtly, almost imperceptibly, smoother to the touch. It was set so perfectly it was nearly invisible. "Samuel," she whispered. He brought the lantern closer. He saw it too. It was a perfectly fitted plug of stone. Using the thinnest of their pry bars, they began to work at the edges of the stone. It was a delicate, nerve-wracking process. For an hour, it didn't move. Then, with a low scraping sound, it shifted. They worked together, applying steady pressure until the stone plug came loose. Behind it, set deep into a carved recess, was a small, rust-pitted iron lever. It was the keystone. They looked at each other, a silent question passing between them. This was the moment. Samuel gripped the lever with both hands and pulled. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, groaning protest of metal that had been silent for 50 years, something shifted within the cliff. A series of heavy, resonant thunks echoed from inside the door, the sound of massive locking bolts retracting. A thin crack of absolute darkness appeared along the door's edge. Together, they put their shoulders to the cold iron and pushed. It swung inward with surprising ease, opening a gateway into the past. The air that billowed out was stale, cold, and utterly devoid of life. It smelled of dry dust and profound stillness. They lit a second lantern and stepped across the threshold. It wasn't a treasure cave. There were no chests overflowing with gold coins. It was a small, dry, stone-cut chamber, no bigger than a miner's cabin. In the center of the room, on a simple, flat-topped stone table sat two objects, a thick, leather-bound ledger and a small, heavy tin box. With trembling hands, Grace reached out and opened the ledger. The pages were filled with the same spidery script from the map. But this was no map. It was a detailed record. Names, dates, amounts. It was Gideon Vale's account of every bribe paid, every claim jumped, every parcel of land acquired through threat and coercion to build the town of Redemption. Page after page detailed the crimes of the town's founding fathers, including a series of transactions signed by Thaddeus Croft, Silas Croft's own father. The tin box contained the original deeds, signed under duress, and sworn affidavits from men who had been run off their land. The treasure wasn't gold. It was the truth. It was the proof that the town of Redemption and the Croft fortune had been built on a foundation of lies and stolen lives. They stood in the chamber, the lantern light flickering on the damning pages of the ledger, the weight of history settling upon them. This was a truth that could tear Redemption apart. As they turned to leave, the evidence held carefully in their hands, a figure appeared at the mouth of the canyon, silhouetted against the bright afternoon sky. Then another and another. Silas Croft, flanked by two hard-faced men she didn't recognize, sat astride his horse, a rifle resting across his saddle. "I knew it," Croft called out, his voice sharp with a mixture of triumph and fury. "I knew you were up to something more than chasing shadows. My father told me stories about this place. He told me to make sure it stayed buried." He had grown suspicious of their joint departure and had followed them. He didn't know exactly what they'd found, but he knew it threatened everything he was. "Whatever you have in your hands," he ordered, "belongs to me." Before Samuel or Grace could respond, the sky, which had been a brilliant blue only moments before, began to darken with an alarming speed. A sudden violent wind whipped through the canyon, howling like a vengeful spirit. A summer storm, the kind that turned these dry washes into raging rivers in minutes, was upon them. The first drops of rain, heavy and cold, began to fall. "Get the book!" Croft yelled at his men over the rising wind. But as they urged their horses forward, the heavens opened. A torrential downpour descended, turning the sandy canyon floor into a slick, muddy soup. Thunder cracked overhead, a deafening explosion that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cliffs. Grace and Samuel instinctively retreated into the relative shelter of the vault chamber. Croft and his men were caught in the open. A wall of brown water, a flash flood, suddenly roared down the canyon, carrying rocks and debris with it. One of Croft's men screamed as his horse lost its footing and was swept away. The other man clung desperately to a rocky outcrop as the water surged around him. Croft himself was pale with terror, his horse rearing, his authority washed away by the sheer power of the storm. In that moment, the ledger in Grace's hands felt secondary. Samuel, his deputy instincts taking over, grabbed a coil of rope from their supplies. "We have to help them," he said, and Grace didn't hesitate. They abandoned the thought of conflict, of vengeance. They braced themselves at the edge of the chamber and threw the rope out into the churning water. They managed to haul Croft's remaining man to safety, and then, with great effort, helped a soaked and terrified Silas Croft scramble out of the flood's path. As they stood there, shivering and breathless, a deep rumbling sound came from above. The deluge had destabilized the cliff face. With a deafening roar, tons of rock and earth slid down, completely burying the entrance to Gideon Vale's vault. The iron door and the chamber behind it were sealed once more, this time by the mountain itself. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived. The floodwaters receded, leaving behind a scene of devastation, and in the unsettling quiet that followed, the four of them stood together. Grace holding the ledger, Samuel with the tin box, and a humbled, defeated Silas Croft, who had lost everything but his life. The power had shifted completely. The past was sealed away again, but its truth was now free. The ride back to redemption was a somber procession. Silas Croft rode between Grace and Samuel, his head bowed, the fight gone out of him. The man he had hired, his face ashen, trailed behind. They didn't speak. The landscape, washed clean by the storm, seemed to hold its breath. When they reached the edge of town, they didn't go to the sheriff's office. The law in redemption was too tangled up in the Croft family's influence. Instead, Samuel led them directly to the small telegraph office at the end of the main street. The operator, a man named Mr. Abernathy with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, had known Grace's father for 20 years. He was a quiet, meticulous man, trusted by all. He looked up in surprise as the strange party entered his office. "Samuel? Miss Whitcomb? Mr. Croft?" he asked, his eyes wide with confusion. Samuel placed the tin box on the counter and opened it. He laid one of the sworn affidavits, yellowed and fragile, before the old man. "We need you to read this, Mr. Abernathy," Samuel said, "and then we need you to send a message to the territorial marshal in Prescott." Abernathy carefully picked up the document. His eyes scanned the faded ink, his expression slowly changing from confusion to shock, then to a deep, solemn gravity. He read aloud, his voice trembling slightly, the story of a rancher forced to sign away his land that now formed the western quarter of the Croft estate, under threat to his family. When he finished, he looked at Silas Croft, who did not meet his gaze. Then he looked at Grace, and in his eyes, she saw not pity, but a profound and quiet respect. He had seen the truth. Wordlessly, Abernathy turned to his telegraph key. The rhythmic clicking filled the small room, a sound that was carrying the long-buried truth out of redemption and into the wider world. A crowd had begun to gather outside, drawn by the sight of Croft's return in such a state. The whispers started again, but this time they were not of mockery. They were whispers of awe and disbelief. People saw the ledger in Grace's hands, the tin box on the counter, the defeated slump of the most powerful man in town. The story spread through the crowd, not as a single narrative, but in fragments of understanding. The truth settled over the town square, rewriting its history in real time. Silas Croft, his face pale, stepped forward. He did not deny it. "It's true," he said, his voice just loud enough to be heard by those closest. "My father, all of them. The town was built on it." He then did something no one expected. He took a pen from Abernathy's desk and a piece of paper, and in a shaky hand, he wrote out a confession, relinquishing his family's claims to all the lands mentioned in Vale's ledger. He was not arrested. He was not run out of town. He was simply diminished, humbled before the community he had once lorded over. An old woman stepped out from the crowd and touched Grace's arm. "My grandfather was the man in that letter," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you." One by one, others came forward, their faces reflecting a dawning recognition that the past was not as they had been told. The laughter that had followed Grace out of town had been replaced by a chorus of reverent silence. She had not found gold, but she had delivered something far more precious. Justice. A season had passed. The autumn sun cast a long golden light over the valley, bathing the land in a soft, forgiving glow. Grace stood on a small rise overlooking a modest but well-tended piece of land. A new cabin, built of fresh-cut pine, stood near a creek, a thin curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney. The land had been her father's original claim, the one he had lost to Thaddeus Croft in a crooked card game decades ago. The territorial court, armed with the evidence from Gideon Vale's ledger, had restored it to her. It was hers. Samuel Price came to stand beside her. He had sold his freight business in redemption and had thrown in his lot with her, his quiet strength a constant presence as they had built this new life together. He had helped her raise the cabin, dig the well, and mend the fences. They worked in a comfortable silence, their shared past a foundation as solid as the rock of the canyon itself. Ebenezer, the mule, grazed peacefully nearby, his retirement spent in green pasture. He had carried her to her destiny, and now he was at rest. The town of Redemption was changing. Some families, their fortunes built on the Crofts' lies, had moved on. Others, whose claims had been validated by the ledger, were rebuilding. The town was smaller, quieter, but more honest. Silas Croft remained, a quiet man who worked at the livery, his arrogance stripped away, leaving behind a man paying a silent, daily penance. "It's a good place," Samuel said, looking at the cabin and the fields beyond. "Your father would be proud." Grace nodded, a small, peaceful smile on her face. "He was always looking for something valuable in the ground," she said softly. "He was just looking in the wrong canyons." Samuel looked at her, his gaze warm. "All that work, all that danger," he said. "What was it you really found in that vault, Grace?" She thought for a moment, the memory of the cold, dark chamber and the weight of the ledger in her hands still vivid. She looked at the home they had built, at the land that was truly hers, at the good man standing beside her. She had cleared her father's debts, but she had gained so much more. "My father's name," she said, her voice clear and steady in the evening air. "And my own." It was all the answer that was needed. They stood together as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose. Two people who had dug up the past not for riches, but to plant a future, Thank you for staying with us for this story of quiet courage and the search for truth. We hope it reminded you of the quiet strength of holding on to what you know is true, even when the world tells you you're a fool. If you enjoyed Grace's journey, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more stories of the forgotten corners of history. Let us know in the comments which part of her discovery moved you the most. We'll be back soon with another tale of a lost soul who finds their way home.